welcome back everyone. My name is Dylan. Welcome to Autonomic Gaming. In light of all the recent leaks and news regarding the Treasure Trilogy Remaster, I thought it would be good to look at the Spyro the Dragon series in retrospective, and today we're going to be doing the first episode of this retrospective series, talking about the first game that came out in 1998. And I kind of wanted to talk about what this game did right, why people enjoyed this game so much for its time period, how it's going to do today on the PS4, what they're going to have to change to adapt this game to be a current title in the 2018 game sphere, and furthermore just give some general explanation of the game to people that may or may not be Spyro fans, people that have never played this title before and maybe they're going to pick it up once this remaster comes out. The first thing I think we should look at is talking about what's going on in 1998 and some of the games that Spyro's often compared to and how it's different and what it brings to the table that kind of changed platforming in the late 90s, early 2000s for the better. Spyro and Crash Bandicoot have pretty much been hand in hand since the two of their inceptions, and Crash Bandicoot did come out first by a couple years, and then a couple years later, Spyro the Dragon came out in 1998. I do think there are several things that Spyro brings to the table that Crash Bandicoot had just not touched on yet. There are a couple things that make Spyro a little bit more modern than Crash, and Crash, when you play it today, it feels like, oh, this does feel like a game from the 90s, even when you're playing the Insane Trilogy Remaster that looks great. It's just the mechanics are a little bit dated. One of the things that stands out to me the most are the overworlds that Spyro has. Very inspired by Mario 64 that came out just 2 years before Spyro, similar to when Crash came out, but Spyro took notes from that Mario 64 series, and there were overworlds and then there were 4 mini-worlds within that overworld that you had to beat to be able to move on through the game. So Spyro was not the first game to do this kind of setup with progression. Mario 64 had just done it 2 years before, and other games had done it as well, but this did start to pivot how games were made in the late 90s to the early 2000s and how games are set up today. And when I talk about games like Crash Bandicoot feeling dated, I think the main thing that I mean is the linearness of these games. You would spawn into a level, you'd have a level set out in front of you, it was a linear progression through this level, and there wasn't as much exploration, there wasn't stuff to find. It was kind of a different style of game that we really don't see anymore, these linear platformers. And I think that's okay, they have their place. I love going back and playing the Insane Trilogy. It was absolutely top polish, it was a beautiful game, but when I did play it, I did revert back to where I was as a kid on the PS1, and it did get old. I can't sit down and play that game for 5-6 hours like I can play a current platformer because of the exploration, the open world aspects that current platformers have is what really draws me in. Another perfect example of this open world platformer would probably be Ratchet & Clank. Ratchet & Clank just got a remaster/reboot in 2014, and it was a beautiful game, just like the Insane Trilogy was, but I was able to play more of it because it was open world exploration, there's more stuff to find, little hidden gems here and there. Or Crash Bandicoot, when you're done with the level, you go back for the perfectionist or you go back for the time trials, but there's not as much meat in the game, there's not as much story there. And of course, Ratchet & Clank is another great example because it's also made by Insomniac Games, which developed the original trilogy for Spyro, and the Ratchet & Clank series did not start until 2002, the PlayStation 2 era, when Insomniac had already moved on from Spyro. I would say it's a direct lineage from Spyro. And it's always a bittersweet thing playing a Ratchet & Clank game because they're all from Insomniac. They've been supported throughout, but after the third Spyro game, Insomniac had to sell the rights to Activision. Who knows why? It could have been a plethora of reasons. It's always an interesting spot. Would Spyro had end up the way that he did, shoved away in a vault, had Insomniac kept the rights all these years? I mean, Ratchet & Clank saw releases all the way through the PS2 era, all the way through the PS3 era, now we have a PS4 Ratchet & Clank. It looks like they would have supported Spyro throughout, and he probably never went down that nasty Skylanders Spyro route. And that was just a little bit of history on what was going on at the time and why it's prevalent when he came out and how he kind of pivoted things from the late 90s to the early 2000s. I definitely don't say that he changed gaming single-handedly, but I would say that he played a good role. Moving on to some of the completionist mechanics that really sucked me in when I was a child, and It took me forever to get my first 100% in a Spyro game, and I remember when I played Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon, it took me a very long time to get 100% in that game. So there are multiple levels to this completionist part of the game. There are gems throughout each level, and what was great is when you hit select, it kind of let you know where you were at, how many gems were left, and you'd have to figure out where they're hiding in these levels. And these developers from Insomniac would put them in just the craziest places that if you didn't think to look there, you could miss it for days at a time of looking for a couple of these gems that just kind of slipped through the cracks. Another thing that was interesting, we were doing a recent playthrough on the channel of just the Spyro game in its entirety, and a couple friends of mine, we just sat down and played through the game, and we noticed that if you were looking at the cam and you looked away and you had a gem at the corner of the screen, it would just disappear, because the PS1 wasn't powerful enough to load all of the assets at once. So what was ever in the FOV, the field of view, was there, and the second you looked away from it, these gems would disappear. So if you're walking by them, sometimes you would just miss them because the PS1 wouldn't be able to load them all at once, so it made it even twice as tricky. The next part of these completionist aspects were the dragon eggs. You'd have these eggs thieves that would steal the eggs, and they'd be running around the levels with them, and you'd actually have to figure out which path that they would take so you could get these eggs. And there was only a limited amount of them in the first game, and later in the second game, and then crazy later in the third game, there were way more. But in this first game, there was only like 15 or 20 of them throughout the game, and you'd have to calculate where these egg thieves were gonna run. And they were, I mean, when I was growing up, they were super frustrating. Now playing it in my mid-20s, I'm like, okay, this isn't too bad. But when you're playing it for the first time, it's very frustrating trying to figure out where they're gonna go, and you have to try 10, 15 times before you actually get to them and capture the egg. So to actually 100% the game, you'd have to get all of the eggs from the egg thieves, you'd have to get every single gem from every hub world and mini world, and then you'd also have to get every dragon statue throughout the game. And I think this brought an immense amount of replayability to the game. You'd be sitting there for hours and hours. You'd had already beaten the levels, you'd already beaten the main story, but you can go back and get these gems throughout the game. You can get the eggs throughout the game. Half of the dragons you don't have to get to know what you're doing, and they don't really build on the story. There's plenty of them that just give you random information, so you can miss some of this stuff if you don't go back and do it. So this completionist part of the game was something that I think that Spyro always kind of had an edge over the Crash games, to where it made you keep coming back to the game. It drawed you in. Once I'm done with the level in Crash, there's rarely a time where I'm like, alright, I want to replay that, even if I missed a gem or I missed some of the peaches / apples, whatever you call them. Or nectarines, I guess. But yeah, even if you miss some of those, I'm not going to go back and be like, alright, I really need to get every single piece in this Crash game. I just don't have that same completionist vibe as I do when I play a Spyro game. The main reason I'm comparing Spyro and Crash and maybe Ratchet and Clank to each other is because these are the three games, these were the Sony mascots in the late 90s, early 2000s. They're constantly compared to each other online. Sly Cooper is usually thrown in there, but Spyro and Crash are like left and right, hand in hand, peanut butter and jelly. They are, you can't have them without each other, so comparing them makes sense in my mind, even though they're very different games, and they're from different developers, Naughty Dog and Insomniac, that, you know, they're from different places, but they're compared so wholly. Another mechanic I like to talk about is Sparks. Sparks adds a health meter to Spyro, just kind of like Aku Aku adds a health meter to Crash, and they really developed that health meter system in Spyro, where they brought in that open world aspect where when you breathe fire on an animal or you headbutt an animal, a butterfly is released, and then you refill your sparks. And that's something that Naughty Dog couldn't do with Aku Aku and Crash in that game, because it wasn't an open world game. You couldn't go back in the level and try to find an animal. It just was, there was an Aku Aku in a box, or there wasn't. Whereas Spyro, if you're low on health, you can be like, alright, I'm low on health, I don't want to die, I'm going to backtrack in this level, go find an animal, and refill my health. And this was something new to these platformers in the late 90s. So this is just another mechanic that I think that they brought to the table with the Spyro series that made it feel like it was from the future. It was something new, something fresh that we hadn't seen in these linear games before. And another good example of that is when you're playing a side-scroller Mario, which is a platformer from Nintendo. If you missed a 1-up or you missed a red mushroom earlier on in the level, you wouldn't be able to go back and get that. And that was something that they changed with these 3D platformers in the late 90s, early 2000s. You could backtrack through the level and kind of go get what you missed or go get what you needed. And that mechanic really brought on a whole new replayability factor that just wasn't there in some of these games before. If you missed something in a Mario game, you'd have to restart the level over again, and that's boring. It's the same way with the Crash game. If you missed something, you'd have to restart the level and then hopefully you get it perfect this time through. Whereas with these Ratchet and Clanks or Spyros, you'd be able to go back in the game, get what you needed, get the 100%, and move on to the next world without restarting. The next mechanic that I'd like to talk about is the story and the storytelling. Now, there are cutscenes in Crash Bandicoot, but outside of those cutscenes, there's really nothing that adds to the story. Unlike how Spyro, there's little bits and pieces of the story throughout the entire game, and you can choose to listen to them or you can skip right through them, so it's really up to the player on what you take away from the story in the end. And that was something that always kept me coming back, was discovering new little things that I had missed from the Elder Dragons, things that they say that maybe I didn't understand when I was younger, and I go back and play it, I'm like, wow, there's a good amount of story here, there's a good amount of extra gameplay that if you pay attention, you learn a lot about the kingdom and the atmosphere, the universe that this game takes place in. And then there's also Elder Dragons that just do nothing. It's like they're angry that you woke them up, and then there's Elder Dragons that are witty and funny humor that's really for adults. Some of the Spyro humor is like adult humor that just soared right over my head as a kid, and then replaying it as an adult, I'm like, God, this is entertaining. And all of this stuff, the story, the mechanics, the open world gameplay, this is why this game feels like it's a current game with bad graphics instead of an old game with mechanics that we don't understand anymore. I think the only thing that this game is left in the dirt by is the controls. The controls feel very archaic. And that's for a few different reasons. The first reason being the camera. The camera had an active cam or a passive cam, and when I was younger I remember playing with the passive cam because that's what I was used to. The active cam wasn't very popular in games yet, where the camera was controlled by something else other than you. And that was pretty hard with the D-pad instead of having joysticks. I remember when I was playing through Spyro, I didn't have joysticks as a kid. I didn't have the very first DualShock controller until probably the year 2000. So playing this platformer on a D-pad brought in a whole new different kind of challenge that was really not meant for by the developers. It wasn't like they were trying to make it harder to play with the D-pad, but playing it today on a D-pad without the joysticks just makes it all the more challenging. That being said, I do have a DualShock still from my original PS1 if I put the game in, and I put it on an active cam where I still have control over it, but it's mostly active. It makes the game so much easier to play with joysticks. But anyone that hasn't played it, I challenge you to play with maybe an Xbox One controller if you're emulating it and only use the D-pad on the passive cam. It's almost impossible to play that way, so the revolution of the DualShock 1 really brought these platformers to life. Now, the other thing that I think that holds this game back a little bit compared to the other titles released later in the series is Spyro's moveset. They really expanded upon his moveset in 2 and then further in 3, and then the GameCube games, he had a crazy moveset where he had all sorts of different breath types, like an ice breath and an electric breath and a fire breath. But the original trilogy, he only had the fire breath. But some of the things that they added with his moveset was he was able to fly and then do this little hover thing at the end to where he could kind of jump up onto ledges after he was done flying, which playing the first game, like I constantly wanted to do that, and you just can't do that. Like, it's a mechanic that wasn't developed yet, and it feels like that piece is holding the game back in compared to the other titles in the series. Other things that I noticed later on was Sparks had a little bit longer of a range to where Sparks would grab gems for you in the first game, just like he's done in all the games, but Sparks wasn't able to move as far in the first game as he was in the second and the third game. He moved a lot farther to grab gems for you, so I think that that's a little bit different in the first game, to where if you've been playing the newer ones and you go back and play Spyro 1, it kind of feels weird that he doesn't just jump out and grab all the gems for you. The third and final thing that really separates Spyro 1 from the games later on in the series is the ability to get into water. Any water source in this game, Spyro dies, he'll lose health, or he'll just drown if you stay in it for too long. Where Spyro 2, it was a huge mechanic to be underwater. There were all sorts of gems and bottles that you had to get underwater, and then the same with 3 and the rest of the series. So it was really just this first game where water would hurt him. Anyways, overall I think it's a great experience. It's a game that everyone should play. It's a platformer that everyone should experience. But there's some other things that really make this game great. The music. The music is some of the best in any music that I've heard in a game. It's beautiful. Somehow all of the songs just match where you're at in the game. It never feels out of place. And the sole part of this musical success is a man named Stuart Copeland, who's pretty much behind the entire soundtrack for the game. He's been renowned for many things that he's done. He's done several themes for Nickelodeon. He's done his own music. He's got all sorts of music with other producers, developers. So his stuff with Spyro it's well renowned in the community, and it's probably one of the high points of the series. So it's crazy to think that a game that came out in 1998, IGN reviewed and gave it a 9 out of 10. I usually don't follow game reviews too much like Metacritic and IGN, but I just thought it was pretty crazy that a game this old, this dated per se, got a 9 out of 10 by a big reviewer like IGN. And I'm gonna have to agree. I think the game deserves a 9 out of 10. I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. It's not quite to that 10 out of 10 level, and I'm gonna be reviewing the other two in the trilogy as a retrospective before the trilogy remaster comes out, and we'll see if they get close to that 10 out of 10 mark. I think Spyro was very close. It was a very close game to 10 out of 10, but I think the things that are holding it back really are those mechanics, those controls that leave the game a little bit in the 90s. It's on the precipice of being a future game that came out in the 2000s, and it's almost a PS2 era game, and I think we'll see a change in that in Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage, and Spyro 3, Year of the Dragon. So we'll be talking about those two games next, and we'll get my opinion on them, and I want to hear your guys' opinion down in the comments below. What do you think about the original Spyro game? How do you think it's held up over the years? Do you think it will do well on the PS4 with these mechanics? What are they going to have to change to make it run better to where people are going to pick this game up and think it's worthy of a remaster? Alright everyone, that's been it. This is Autonomic Gaming. My name's Dylan. Thanks so much for listening. As always, if you could like or subscribe, that really helps us out. We're a small channel trying to get noticed out here in the gaming community. Let me know what you think. If you like the videos, let me know down below. If you've got any criticism, I'm all ears. Have a good one, guys.